Can you hear me okay back there? Yeah, okay. I don't think there's a mic, so I'll try to speak loudly. And there's seats further up too. We can always move chairs up. It's a pretty informal setting. I'm Jamie Lawson, the Planning Director for the City of Burlington. We're so excited to have you all here. Bree Smith is our Planning Office Manager. There's plenty of people around the room that we would like to thank, and I'll sort of do that throughout the day. But this is our first seminar for continuing education, promoting the City of Burlington and the efforts that are going on in terms of historic preservation, efforts in the downtown in terms of economic development, and ongoing efforts in our local historic districts and our landmark designations. So there's information in the folders that can give you some more information on us and also where you can find things. But today we're here to welcome three speakers, the first of which is Donovan Rypkema. Good enough?
Close enough.
Okay. He'll correct me, I'm sure, from PlaceEconomics. Okay. And then we'll be followed later on by James Shield. And I'll go through the bios for each of the speakers before they start. James Shield will be speaking from 11 to 12, 15. And then we'll have a lunch followed by Tracy Schmidt, who is from Beer Works. And then in the afternoon, we'll have a panel from different folks coming up. And we've got just general questions that we have prepared to get some conversations going. So feel free to ask any questions along the way. Just in terms of the room, we are free to use all of upstairs, and then I think also maybe upstairs on the patio if you want to have time for lunch up there. I'm not sure if it's wet or not. The bathrooms are back here on the left. And I just wanted to give a special thanks to all of our partners who have helped to make this event so successful. We should have, if everyone comes, we should have about 45 people, so we're really excited about that. But we've got the State Historic Preservation Office who helped to fund this program and continues to help support us over and over because we're a certified local government. And then we have folks from Preservation North Carolina. Kathleen is here. Turner to support us as well. City of Burlington, Preservation Burlington, folks from around the room are all here. You can raise your hand if you're part of Preservation Burlington. Okay, good number. And then we also have Burlington Beer Works as well as our speakers. So we're really excited about this, and we see this as an ongoing conversation to be together in various locations to talk about different topics. So we'll be looking for your input on additional things that you would like us to bring to the table so that we can help to bridge gaps on anything that you're looking to hear about. So at this point, I think I'll just turn it over to, and here's our contact information, but we have cards too in the So I think unless anybody has any questions, I will turn it over to Donovan. Okay.
Okay.
Yep, so let me do a quick introduction. Donovan Rypkema. Better?
Yeah.
Okay. is a principal of PlaceEconomics, a Washington, D.C. based real estate and economic development consulting firm. The work of the firm is at the nexus of historic preservation and economics. He has undertaken assignments for public and nonprofit sectors clients in 49 U.S. states. He also teaches a course on economics of historic preservation at the University of Pennsylvania, where he received the 2008 G. Holmes Perkins Award for Distinguished Teaching. Let's welcome Donovan. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jamie. I used to have a plaque on my office wall. And I'd read it in some business publication. Then I had a friend of mine make a plaque, and it said, "If you eat a live frog first thing every morning, nothing worse will happen all day." So this is kind of this economic stuff. This will be your live frog for the day. Nothing worse will happen, and I'm kind of the warm-up act for Mr. Shields. So. So, and I've of course been in North Carolina and Burlington lots of times, and over the years done lots of work for Preservation North Carolina. But one of my big thrill moments was when Myrick Howard and I first went to Glencoe after PNC first acquired it. And I was just so excited, and so I'm hoping to go back today because it's such a fabulous place. So here's what I think really important. My little niche in the world, as Jamie said, is this economic part of historic preservation. But in fact, preservation has lots of values: aesthetic and social and cultural and associative and environmental and educational, whole range of values. And I really believe that those are important. Historic preservation also has economic value. And in fact, if we don't find an economic value for most historic resources, then the vehicle for the rest of those values is lost as well. And it's not at all that the economic values are more important. They are not more important. Of all of those values, in the long run, economic value is the least important in the long run. But as the great British economist John Maynard Keynes said, in the long run we're all dead. And so in the short run we have to figure out ways to incorporate into our set of arguments for historic preservation the economic argument as well. So this is what it's going to feel like today, like the Eternal Economics seminar. And I actually, earlier this week, I was in, where was I?
Travel a lot?
Yeah, traveled a bit. No, I was in some town, wherever I was, and I was making a presentation, and it was an Episcopal church. I'm much more comfortable in a beer co-op. So a few years ago, we did a study of the state historic tax credit in Pennsylvania, and we were about 80% done with the study, and our client called up and said, "Hey, we're having a meeting in Harrisburg, and we know you're not quite done, but could you come up and just tell us your findings so far?" So I said, "Sure," and went to Harrisburg and did this presentation, went back to Washington. And the next day, I got an email from a guy who said, "I enjoyed your short presentation at Preservation PA the other afternoon. It was as interesting as the topic would allow." And so that's my threshold for myself to make a decision. So I thought that was clever, and so I put his comment on our Facebook page, and then another person who was there had some suggestions that maybe I could make it more interesting for people to read. My great young colleague Caitlin does all of our design work. She has vetoed that so far, but I keep working at it. I want to start with some economic geek talk, and I'll apologize for that. And if you doze off, you're perfectly, absolutely understandable, no difference. But this issue about revealed preference and stated preference. So I know that you all came here this morning so we could talk about this chart and the mathematics of doing that. But I have a different way of explaining it. Is that I could say to you, which of you prefer vanilla ice cream? A bunch of you would raise your hand. Which of you prefer chocolate? A bunch of others. That's stated preference. I raise my hand, I like chocolate ice cream better. Or We could have another approach. We could simply roll in a cart with a bunch of ice cream cones, some of which are chocolate, some are vanilla, and you'd take one. And that reveals your preference. You don't have to say that I like chocolate better, you took the chocolate cone. And so that's much of our research is based on that revealed preference. What is the marketplace saying? People in the marketplace saying about their preference for historic districts, historic neighborhoods, historic buildings, whatever. Half of our work is on economic impact studies of historic preservation. And so lots of what you'll hear from me this morning is findings from those studies. And I want to start with some stated preference studies. So sometimes we, in addition to our kind of evaluating, we're a quantitative research firm, so we look at numbers. But sometimes we supplement that with surveys. And we did some work in Portland, Maine, and did some survey work there. And one of the questions, why do you live in Portland? And at the top of the list was the character and sense of place of Portland, and then lifestyle and so forth. So, okay, why do they live there? The character of the place. And then they talked about a series of these questions where you could, take in the survey, strongly agree, strongly disagree, someplace in between. And so one of the statements was historic preservation maintains Portland character and identity. So, 85–90% agreed with that statement. So they're coming for the character, and historic preservation is adding to that character. We looked at this issue about, it was a big one in Portland, and housing affordability issues, and I'll talk more about that later. And this idea of rental units in historic districts are less desirable to rent. Nobody believes that. No, it certainly wasn't the case. And so it's this stated preference about the importance of preservation. And then you've all taken these surveys where there's a little button at the bottom, and you can move it from 1 to 10 or 1 to 100, however it's structured. And so we did one of those, and again, we're very disciplined about neutrality of the survey question. So we don't do the politician kind of question. Oh, don't you agree with 100% of your neighborhoods that Senator Smith is the greatest thing ever? We don't do that. We do it so we can get real answers. So we had this range. Portland would be just as good a city without historic preservation. That's one point. The midpoint was historic preservation neither adds nor detracts from the quality of life in Portland, and then Portland is a much better city because of historic preservation. And there's what the answers were. The end of the curve about the importance that preservation was to the quality of the city. So that's Portland, Maine. Then Palm Beach, Florida. Any of you been to Palm Beach, Florida? It's a Mondo Bizarro place. It's a really weird place. 9,500 people. 2 different streets that they call Billionaires Row. Not Millionaires Row, Billionaires Row. The cheapest house for sale was $985,000. It was a little cottage left there. Weird place on all kinds of things, but they were concerned about the impact of historic designation on property values, and so that's how we did the study. But as part of that, we did a survey there as well. And again, our surveys, we always look for a kind of neutral distribution of the links to the survey, online surveys. In this case, the city had a kind of mailing list of residents, and so we looked at it. They have a interesting approach to preservation there. But so one of the questions when thinking about Palm Beach, how important are the following to you personally? And there was a whole bunch of attributes. Well, so you have 2/3 of them saying it's very important, and another 20% saying important. You could not get 90% of the people in Palm Beach, Florida, to agree that the sun rises in the east, and yet that's the support for preservation. And then, which of the following would significantly reduce the quality of life? Well, the loss of historic character. So it's a strong draw on one side, the loss of it, a big negative effect. Then they have a wonderful, expansive, but wonderful kind of main street called North Avenue there. And we asked about the importance of the historic character, and once again, just overwhelmingly, historic character, more important than the merchandise, more important than the labels on the stuff you can buy there. the historic character was what's most important. And then this list of what's important to you, well, top of the list, no surprise, public safety. And second, they're old and they're rich. So of course, public safety legitimately is a top issue. Then architectural quality, the weather, and historic character. Those are the things. And here's the literally people who can live any place in the world. There's no. I used to not believe the thing that cliche, money doesn't matter. Well, there doesn't matter. There's so much that doesn't matter. They could live any place. Choosing to live there, historic preservation and character are a major part of it. And then on the other side, on the negative impacts, high on the list are if we lost our historic resources. And then I came here from St. Petersburg. Just yesterday released a study that we'd done in St. Petersburg. And again, we did a similar, can I change this setting here someplace? What I'd like to do is be able to see the whole slide here. I can read better. Can you make that so I'm looking at the whole slide instead of this preview thing? Yeah. Sorry about that. When you get as old as me, you can't do the techno stuff. Ordinarily, I like some guy with tattoos and ponytails at 20, but. Thank you. That's perfect.
Is that
Thank
better?
you very much.
How about now our view is weird? Okay.
Yeah, you can look at the small version. So. Perfect. There you go. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Do you want to use this?
Yeah. Thanks. So there we did a survey as well. And again, we asked the question, why do you live in St. Petersburg? And people could check more than one. The top reason, the character, sense of place of St. Petersburg, followed good lifestyle amenities, restaurants, recreation, and then arts and cultural environment in St. Petersburg. All of these kind of ephemeral things. It's not something you can touch. It's this kind of quality of that place that why people choose to be there. And then, how do you feel about the following statements? It's the number one list. And again, this was a broad-based survey. Number one list, historic preservation maintains St. Petersburg character and identity. That's why they're coming there, and it's historic preservation at the top of the list of what's maintained. How do you rank the following important for the future of St. Petersburg? Main top answer, maintaining historic character of St. Petersburg. And this is a place, frankly, that has great historic resources, very few of which are protected by local historic districts or being vulnerable, which would significantly reduce the quality of life, well, diminish public safety, no surprise, and then lost historic character. So it's the strength on one side, character is why people are coming there, and the big risk is that it disappears, and it's all vulnerable there. And then there was a question, the city of St. Petersburg has a big sustainability initiative. We want to make sure it's a sustainable city. And the top answer for implementing sustainability was adaptive reuse of existing buildings. Overwhelmingly, that was the top choice, including we sorted out the questions, and we even sorted those who had cared not at all about historic preservation, those that are on the we don't care side. Still, their top priority was adaptive reuse of existing buildings. And then, totally different than St. Peter or Palm Beach, Calgary, Ontario. And they're this big city in Western Canada, and they have 4 commercial districts that have a concentration of heritage buildings. And what they asked, interesting assignment, they asked for a triple bottom line estimate of the value of those districts, which was the triple bottom line of social, economic, and environmental, and they wanted those monetized. So it's the dollar value of each of those values. And so our firm had the social and the economic value. Of the architecture firm in Calgary did the environmental. And again, we did a survey of a list from the city in choosing a commercial district to visit. How important is each of these variables? Number one is walkable, and then historic character of the area. And then, so that's some stated preference stuff. So we have done over the last 4 or 5 years a number of city-level impact of preservation studies in big cities, New York and Los Angeles and Phoenix and San Antonio, and then little places, Frankfort, Kentucky, and Saratoga Springs, New York, and Cumberland, Maryland, and then some mid-sized Raleigh some years ago, Savannah, Miami-Dade County. So we have this kind of range, and now we just finished one in Columbia, South Carolina, and the one in St. Pete. So we're covered up there yet. So this is where you're going to get the factoids from. One of the studies that we did was for the state of Arkansas, and we looked at their grants program, their tax credits, and their Main Street program. Just as an example. So here's what it's going to feel like over the next, it's going to feel like 6 hours and 12 minutes. It's actually going to be a little shorter than that. It's only going to be 5 hours of this. Our firm likes to think of ourselves as kind of myth breakers. And the trouble with historic preservation is often a whole bunch of people believe a whole bunch of stuff that just ain't so. But you have to respond to that with information, documentation, not just, oh, we think you're wrong about that. And that's really what our firm does. We're called a historic preservation firm, but in fact we are in the economic development business. By the way, who can identify this location? There is a $5 prize for whoever can do that.
Charleston?
What?
Charleston?
No, so you owe me $5, anyone else want to?
But I don't know.
It's Glencoe.
It's a factory.
So anyway, one of the magic things, you don't have to care about cornices and gargoyles. One of the things about historic preservation is this issue of labor intensity. So in the United States, when you build a new building, about half the money goes for labor, about half goes for materials. When you do the rehabilitation of a historic building, 60 to 70% of that goes to labor, the balance to material. And this has a huge impact on the local economy. Because if you think that the plumber installs a sink, first of all, you bought the sink from China or someplace, but you install the sink doesn't spend any more money, but the plumber does. He or she joins the YMCA, they buy groceries, they go to the movies. And so this recirculation in the local economy is much greater on labor than it is materials, and you have rehabilitation that's decidedly greater in labor component. And here's one of the ways that it manifests itself. Again, in this Arkansas study, we looked at their tax credit program. And of course, North Carolina, between the historic tax credit and the mill credit, is maybe the best in the country in terms of encouraging private sector investment and great impact of that. But so the Arkansas program, 21 million in credits, 342 buildings, spurred 224 million in private investment. But then one thing that I think we as preservationists don't emphasize enough, particularly in kind of politically conservative states, is that when you do historic tax credit projects, that first of all, they encourage the use of the federal tax credit. When you have a good state tax credit like you do in North Carolina, it encourages the use of the federal tax credit. And in Arkansas, we found that it increased by 58% the use of the federal credit because there was a good state credit. That means the money is staying in your state, not going to Washington. And for those politicians who are saying, oh, those guys in Washington, they're all idiots and we don't want them having any more money we have to give them. Well, here's a way to do it, is you do the tax credit project and it keeps those dollars in the state that otherwise would have flowed to Washington. And what that meant is every time $1 million was invested in Arkansas, 175 direct jobs and another 133 indirect jobs, $7 million in direct labor income, and that's income in Arkansas. Now there may be somebody from Oklahoma that's hired to provide some, but that doesn't count. It's not included in the data. This is in fact, Arkansas impacts. Furthermore, every time $1 million worth of activity was generated in rehabilitation, there was another $700,000 in economic activity elsewhere in the state. So it's this real multiplier of economic activity. But it's not just in tax credit projects. Here's Los Angeles. Los Angeles has quite a few local historic districts, and I'll give you some data from there, but they don't have very many commercial historic districts in LA. They call them Historic Preservation Overlay Zones, HPOZs, but the same as our local historic districts. And here's clearly a booming economy in Los Angeles, But both the local historic districts, such as there are in commercial areas, and the National Register districts had growth rate decidedly greater than the city as a whole. That is revealed preference. Nobody's making those businesses go and open a new business, hire people in a historic district. They are choosing to do that, and later I'll talk about the reasons why. Here's Nashville, that some people could argue is maybe too overheated economy. 40% job growth in the historic district compared to 9% of the rest of the city. Booming economy, 4 times as much rate of job growth in the historic districts as the city. And then, of course, downtown revitalization, and Burlington could be the poster child for downtown revitalization. And a couple of years ago, just before the last conference I went to before the plague hit us all, was the state Main Street Conference in North Carolina. And we just finished our second study of the impacts of Main Street in North Carolina, and $3 billion with a B investment over the life of the North Carolina Main Street program, and it kind of kept increasing its pace, and now they're almost at $4 billion. I saw Liz Parham, the director in Birmingham a couple of days ago, and it's really growing. Here's again, this is the geekiest number thing, well maybe not, but a geeky one for you, is one of the challenges with Main Street numbers. You all know Main Street, and from the beginning, 50 years ago almost, the National Main Street Center said, local Main Street manager, you got to keep track of data. And that was one of the great decisions that they made. So now for a numbers geek like me, there's all kinds of number stuff out there. One of the problems is, all right, here's what the Main Street community's done. So many net new jobs, net new business. How do we know that every, town didn't have that same rate? And the trouble now, ideally, if you were a real scholar, you'd say, okay, we're going to look at Burlington, a Main Street town, and then let's look at a town as close as we can to the same characteristics as Burlington and see how they changed over time. The trouble is, even if we could find that kind of matched pair, well, the other town didn't keep the data, so you don't have anything to compare. So that's, the Main Street data is, to an extent, it's kind of academic weakness is that it's in isolation. Here's what Main Street, what did the other place do? So we found at least one measurement of that. Federal government does some things good, some things not so good. Oh, I'm going to come back to that. So, sorry, I talked to that too soon. So here is this in North Carolina Main Street, this shift from the public to private over time. So it started with predominantly private investment, a lot from the public, but private. And then the city started seeing this is really making sense, so let's make investments in sidewalks and parking lots and in streets or whatever. And then shift back to in the $3 billion to 2/3 of it coming from the private sector. So here this is again North Carolina, where there were 6,500 net new businesses and 23,000, 24,000 net new jobs, building rehabilitation and facade easements. But here's, I'm sorry, this is when I started talking too soon. The geeky one is this comparison. Well, the federal government does some things good and some things not so good, but they do a great job of keeping track of numbers. One of the numbers that they keep every year, both at the national and the state level, is the number of businesses that opened and the number of businesses that closed. Okay? And so that's a kind of ends up with a ratio that, and the black horizontal line is if there were exactly the same number of businesses that opened as closed. Okay? Over the long haul, there's the average over the long is there's usually the ratio is usually 1.1 to 1.2 to 1. That is 11 or 12 open for every 10 that close. And if you have more closing than opening, you obviously have a declining economy. Okay? So here is the U.S. numbers. And so you can see it kind of goes in this pattern, and then you saw the big recession in 2009, where there fell below 1, meaning more businesses closed than opening, then it gradual recovery. So that's what the country looked like. Here's what North Carolina looked like. Some kind of more volatile, more ups and downs, but largely the same pattern over time in the state of North Carolina. Here is the North Carolina Main Street communities, open and closed. So even in down markets, they're opening more than they're closing. And so this is a way to say what's happening in this preservation-based downtown economic development program. what's happening there as compared to what's happening in the state and the nation, again, the Main Street. Preservation-based economic development is outperforming. And this, we've now looked at this measurement in, I don't know, 7 or 8 states where we've done Main Street, same answer. Not just in Main Street communities, however, is when we did the Raleigh study some years ago. I have young staff, of course, everybody under 80 is young to me, but young staff, and they're always pushing to look at new metrics, new ways of looking at things. So one of the things we looked at in Raleigh was Yelp ratings for restaurants. And you know, most of the top 10 choices or top 20 choices in Yelp were in historic buildings or in historic districts, meaning there's more than just the food that people are choosing. You know, it's not insignificant percentage of all the restaurants in Raleigh that are in historic buildings, but disproportionate of the top choices. And then we looked at, of course, you all know Raleigh, big 50 miles away from here, big for years now, vibrant downtown, lots of development, lots of going on. But yeah, I'm a market economy guy, but I don't care about the big guys. I care about the little businesses. That's what interests me. And so we looked at the new businesses coming into downtown. Most of the little guys started. Well, almost half of them chose to be in historic buildings. Again, this is revealed preference. They are choosing to be there. They're not choosing to be in the new high-rise. They're choosing to be for lots of reasons. Cost being one, character being another. Reflective of their particular business. And another quarter of them just told old stuff that wasn't listed yet. Then the issue about heritage tourism. We look at it when we have to. My goal in life, and I got to reach it soon because I'm old, my goal in life is when you say economics and historic preservation, that the default response is not, you must mean heritage tourism. Heritage tourism is important. We'll talk about the numbers. It's just that it's not remotely the only contribution. So we only look at it when we have to, but when we do, it makes a difference. So nobody would think about Frankfort, Kentucky as a big heritage tourism place, but we were fortunate we did a study there, and they wanted to look at tourism. Well, again, the heritage overnight visitors, about 20%, heritage day visitors, 14%, so a third of their visitors are there, but in the expenditures, a much greater share of what the visitors are spending coming from the heritage visitors than those coming to Frankfurt for some other reason. And so what we looked at is that the heritage travels, $33 million, almost a third of all of the tourism impact came from the heritage overnight visitors. And what's interesting is when you travel, basically spend all of your money in 5 areas. You spend it on food and beverage, you spend it on lodging, you spend it on local transportation. And I make that distinction because I flew on American Airlines from Tampa to GSO, but North Carolina doesn't benefit from that. Atlanta and Dallas benefits from that. But the rental car I got in GSO to drive here, and a taxi, Uber, all of those are local. So you look at local transportation. So the 5 areas: lodging, food and beverage, retail purchases, local transportation, and then this miscellaneous category that's I paid an admission fee, I went to whatever. It's not just that heritage visitors spend more in total. They spend more in every one of those areas. And so whether you're a retailer or a restaurant owner or whatever, you're getting a bigger share of dollars when you cater to heritage visitors than the people who come to play golf. And again, here's the expenditures by category in Frankfurt, every one of which the heritage visitors spent more. Nashville was another interesting thing, and they have just a fabulous collection of tourism data in Nashville. And the city there was our client, but they also had a great young woman who is big a numbers geek as me, so she had the tourism data pool. And so she just shared all of her data. For those of you who are deep into historic preservation, you'll know that there's tangible heritage, like this building, a great historic building. There's intangible heritage. There's traditions, patterns, festivals, whatever, that are heritage. You just can't touch a wall to see them. Well, of course, in Nashville, one of the great music cities in the world, is their intangible heritage. we stumbled onto it. We weren't looking for it. We stumbled onto it. There's this extraordinary connection between the music, the intangible heritage in Nashville, and the tangible heritage. Much more likely to be in historic buildings than music venues. The people who were heritage visitors were much more likely to go to a bunch of music activities than non-heritage visitors. So this symbiosis, or this connection between the tangible and intangible heritage was just breaking in Nashville. A few years ago, I read about a study in Norway where it said that only 6 to 10% of the money spent by heritage visitors was actually spent at the heritage site that they went to visit. So I thought, ooh, that's kind of interesting. Let's experiment with that methodology. So we're doing a statewide study in Utah with virtually the same number. Utah is a big state, a couple of large cities, mostly little towns around a very geographically big state, many of whom have like one little historic site or some historic attraction. And we looked at the same answer. Is only 7% of the tourism expenditures were spent at the heritage site that they went to visit. That was the magnet that got them there, but they weren't the ones that got the money. Now, I know some of you are probably involved with house museums or historic sites or something. You never have any money, and so you go to the city council and say, hey, can you give us enough money this year to pay the light bill or whatever? And some council members say, well, for God's sake, can't you even do that with the admissions fees you're charging or the donation thing? Well, no, you can't. But that doesn't matter. Is that you're the reason that the visitors are coming, but it's the restaurateur, the hotel operator, the retail shop that are getting the vast majority of that money. So that's this kind of leveraged economic development. Now, in St. Augustine, that claims to be the oldest European settlement in North America, but sea level rise, they're on the water, and they're trying to, in lots of historic resources, and so they're trying to come up with mitigation strategies. So we were part of a team that did a resiliency study in St. Augustine, and we had 2 assignments there. One of them was to just estimate the value and look at the change in value of the historic resources in St. Augustine, and consistent with what we usually find, the rate of value increase in the historic district greater than the rest of the residential area. But we looked at this, and that the value as real estate of the historic properties in St. Augustine, nickels and dimes, over $1 billion. Okay, assignment 1. Keep that number in mind. So we looked at that. But the other assignment we had was to look at the impact of heritage visitors, and particularly when there was a storm event, how that impacted the daily revenues in St. Augustine. So we looked at this. Once again, they had great tourism data, and about 29%, about 30% were people, we called them our core heritage visitors, those who went to St. Augustine specifically because of historic resources. There was another quarter who we called opportunity heritage visitors, who maybe went to sit on the beach, but while they were there did heritage activities. So those were 2 categories, so about 55% of all visitors fell in those categories, and we divided them by day visitors and night visitors, and how many direct jobs and indirect jobs and all of those areas were created. But we then used, again, a kind of geeky academic approach, but it's called the travel cost method. Now think about this. You decide that you want to go to Atlanta to a baseball game, and you're going to drive down for the weekend to go to baseball. Well, the value of that baseball game to you, decidedly more than the purchase of the 2 tickets. You spent 2 days worth of time, you bought gasoline, you drove down there, you bought a bunch of meals, you stayed in the hotel. So the value was not the $80 that the 2 tickets cost you, but the sum of those expenditures you made over time. So because we had all this great data in St. Augustine, we did this approach. How many visitors, how far did they come, how much did they spend every day, why did they come? They took all of these components and said that's really the value of those historic resources. Said it was valued as real estate of about $1 billion. Well, in the bottom right-hand corner, no, almost $3 billion is the value of those historic resources in St. Augustine based on what people were willing to spend to go to visit them. Then this issue about property values. And again, I'll acknowledge this is a 2-edged sword. It has some negative consequences. But for a long time, the concern often raised by people in the real estate community is a stupid historic district. Make a local historic district, that's one more layer of regulation, and that is prima facie going to have an adverse effect on my real estate. Well, it's the one area that's been looked at by more people with more methodologies in more parts of the country than any other. And almost universally, the answer is the opposite of that. That here's the change in value over time in Frankfurt. Again, the local historic districts outperform the rest of the market. And the average selling price greater than the historic district. Saratoga Springs, New York, interesting town. Not an inconsiderable amount of wealth there. It's kind of a second home for lots of people, and then the big racing events. But they asked for a study that primarily looked at value impact on property values and local listing. So we looked at every combination that we could think of to measure the difference. And again, our methodology is what's true of these properties in historic districts, what's true of the properties someplace else. So we looked at the average value of the house, the average value per square foot of houses. We looked at the average value per square foot by age for pre-1900, 1900 to 1925, and so forth. We looked at the average value by style, in that in Saratoga Springs, Victorian is the primary style. So if your Victorian house was in a historic district, it was worth more than a Victorian house not in a historic district. We looked at condition of the property. If your house was just in normal condition in a historic district, it's still more valuable than a house in normal condition in the rest of the city. So every measure that we looked at, in fact, historic districts did better. And this has another impact, and that's in foreclosure patterns. Again, we had early 2000s where real estate values were going up at kind of cocaine-driven levels of speed, and then a big crash, and then a recovery, and millions of Americans lost everything, lost all of their family wealth because they just wiped out in foreclosure. So we looked at this foreclosure pattern during the depths of that crisis. Here is Raleigh, where over that 2008 to 2013, which is kind of the real estate recession, I think almost one house in 10 faced some kind of foreclosure actions in Raleigh. The rate in National Register districts, half of that, and in local districts, half of that. Here is San Antonio. Every single historic district, some quite wealthy, some the opposite of quite wealthy, every one had lower foreclosure rates than the city as a whole. Pittsburgh, again, decidedly lower foreclosure rate in the local and National Register districts than the city. So wherever you look, it's the same answer. Now, why is that? It's not that people who live in historic districts never get fired or get divorced or run their credit card bill up too much. I think it's this. If I get myself in financial trouble, that even in weak markets, I can get my property sold before I go into that foreclosure process. There's even in weak markets a kind of latent demand I can get that property sold. Somebody ought to be paying attention. If this real estate foreclosure thing wipes out millions of Americans, and if historic districts are a mitigator, then HUD and the Bankers Association, the Board Association of Realtors ought to be paying attention to this huge difference it makes on people's lives. And then small business, again, that's my interest. Saratoga Springs, we did look at where small businesses were choosing to locate, where their revealed preference were. Local historic districts had 22% of all jobs, but small firm jobs, 31%, young firms, 46%, choosing to be in a historic district. Here is San Antonio, and the purple areas are local historic districts. The green circles are the concentration of jobs in small businesses. And it's not that every small business is in the historic district, but there's a clustering pattern. They want to be in or near where, in fact, there's character stuff that reinforces small business. And then kind of related to small and startup businesses. I said, again, that Los Angeles doesn't have very many commercial historic districts, but in those they do. The jobs in the startup jobs twice as high in local historic districts than in the city as a whole. Nashville, again, heated economy, overheated economy. The historic districts, 3% of all jobs, 11% of job growth, 13% of startup jobs, 15% of small business jobs, choosing to be in historic districts. Then New York, not a cheap place to do business, whatever you are, but for 12.5% of all the jobs are in historic districts in Manhattan, but 18% of startup jobs, young jobs, choosing to be in historic districts. And this is particularly true of jobs in the creative and knowledge worker classes. We kind of look at those in particular. We did a statewide study in Rhode Island, and their historic districts have about 4% of all of the jobs in historic districts. But the professional, scientific, and technical services, educational services, other services, management companies, and importantly, arts and entertainment, the creative class, greater shares in historic district than the rest of the city. Then you can love New York City or you can hate New York City, but nobody can say it's not one of the most creative cities in the world. And again, 12.5% of all the jobs in Manhattan are in historic districts, but the information jobs, the knowledge worker, the educational services in knowledge worker, and importantly, the creative class. Almost a quarter of all the creative class jobs are in historic districts in Manhattan, twice the rate. It's not an accident. It's not an accident that those are the choices that those places make. Then kind of at the other end of the economic health spectrum is Cumberland, Maryland, the city way in the west end of Maryland, almost stone's throw from West Virginia, and not a healthy economy. A shrinking economy on almost all measures, except in historic districts, where there's, in fact, economic growth. And then millennials and housing. So there's lots of conventional wisdom. Okay, well, the old people like those historic districts, but that's not millennials. They've now outnumbered us baby boomers, and they don't care about that stuff. Well, the national, so we've looked at this issue a lot, and here is the Los Angeles by age category where they choose to live, and the line is largely parallel, except there, where there's a greater propensity to live in historic districts, and that's age group is millennials. Here's Nashville. In the whole city of us baby boomers, about the same rate of us living in historic districts and living elsewhere, greater share of millennials living in historic districts. And then this is the National Association of Realtors. They do a really good job of seeing who their customers are. So this was a few years ago, they did this study where millennials were 34% of all of the buyers, but they were 59% of the buyers of pre-1912 housing and 44% of housing built between 1912 and 1950, 60. So this choice. Now, why are they doing it? Well, some of them because they love gargoyles, but a lot of them on the 3 C's, that is cost and character and convenience, in those historic districts where they're located close to their job, close to their kids' schools, whatever. I don't know what the arguments are in Burlington, but most cities around are saying we gotta have density. We gotta have density if we're gonna have efficient water system and sewer system, if we're gonna provide housing, with shorter drives for the ambulance and the fire department and the cops. We gotta have density. No argument with that. But the second step in that series of arguments in many places, and your stupid historic districts are keeping us from building 40-story high-rises, and so you're the ones keeping us from having density. Common argument every place. So we've looked at this issue about what's the density in historic districts. Well, here's Indianapolis. We looked at the historic districts. We looked at the rest of the area, the residentially zoned area. 50% greater. This, by the way, for those who actually read the labels, the compact area. Indianapolis has a consolidated government, city and county, and so they have a whole bunch of farmland inside the city. So that wouldn't be fair. Of course, it'd be more dense than that. So we just did this kind of urban core of Indianapolis as a comparison. Here's Los Angeles. Nobody calls it a dense city, and yet the density in the historic districts twice of what it is in the rest of the residentially zoned area. Here's Raleigh, and one of my favorites. So at the beginning of the 20th century, Raleigh had a population density of almost 8,000 people per square mile, and then suburban expansion, automobile, stuff, it goes down, kind of stays flat for a number of years. But here is Raleigh, I can't say today because the study's a couple years old, but here is the city of Raleigh as a whole has a population density of 2,500 people per square mile. Local historic districts twice that amount, and the National Register districts almost twice that amount. My great young colleague at the time, Bree Grosicki, I said, here's what I want you to do. I want you to find me 2 neighborhoods in Raleigh, and the only thing I care about is that they're both about the same size acreage. And I want one to be an old neighborhood and one a relatively new subdivision. And then we're just going to look at what the differences are. So she found them. You probably know these neighborhoods. Oakwood as a historic district, and Reedham, Oaks, Wyndham, and newer subdivision. Population 1,700 in Oakwood, 500 in Reedham. Size both 114 acres, so same size. About 800 housing units in Oakwood, 127 in Reedham, Oaks. And the average year of construction, 1925 versus 1992. So you got it. So that was our base, and we started looking at the differences. Average size of the house, 2,400 versus 35. There's nothing bad about that. Some people want a bigger house, nothing wrong with that. The average value of the house, $315,524. And here is where a city's finance officer gets overexcited and makes a premature calculation. Yeah, see, that's why we like that new stuff. That's what we're getting. Just chill, Mr. Finance Guy, for a minute. It's always a Mr. Finance Guy, by the way. And then taxes per unit, 2,800 versus 4,800, and now he's all excited. See, I'm telling you, that's why the stupid historic district is dragging down our budget. We got to have that. Okay. Population per acre, 14.5 versus 4.5. Average square feet of road per housing unit. Now, the developer may have built the initial roads, but it's forever going to be maintained by the public. So how much you have to spend on road maintenance is directly related to how much area you have. So you have 1,000 square feet per unit versus 2,200. Then taxes per acre, 22,000 versus 5,000. And then water and sewer, sooner or later, water and sewer lines are going to have to be replaced. The replacement cost, 8,900 versus 25,000. Annual taxes, 2.2 million versus 630,000. Where each neighborhood is contributing to the fiscal health of the city, it's the historic district gap.
I think the one measure, another measurement you need in there is number of kids that visit on Halloween. There's the true test.
That's worth $1. It's not worth $100.
All right.
Well, I want to come back to that. Actually, that's a good one, and I want to bring it back because I'll mention in a minute why it's actually a good idea. Then the area that both nationally and internationally has been expanding is the look at the contribution of historic resources to the whole environmental responsibility side of things. So whenever we've got data where it's appropriate, we look at that. So we did Phoenix, again a place hot and water shortage and all those things. And so we looked at the differences in historic neighborhoods and the rest of Phoenix. Now part of it is tree cover. It's not just that the 1950, 40 building makes all the difference, although it makes some. But the difference in things like greenhouse gas benefits, gallons of water saved because of the nature of those things. In Los Angeles, we looked at what happens when you demolish a modest size 2,000 square foot house. Well, that means that almost 300 cubic yards of crap go into the landfill, 84 tons of stuff going that way. Then when Michael Bloomberg was mayor of New York City, he wanted to put New York on the path to be the most environmentally responsible city in the world. Good businessman that he is, he said, step one, we have to figure out where we're using energy now. So he ordered this massive energy audit, tens of thousands of both commercial and residential buildings. Now, I love environmentalists, God bless them, but for decades, they've been saying, you gotta get rid of those old buildings, they're just energy hogs, the wind's blowing through them, we gotta replace those with green gizmo buildings. Well, what the study in New York looked at, and what had anything to do with preservation, he just wanted to say, where are we using the energy? In fact, every decade that went forward, using more energy per square foot, not less. In fact, the least energy consumptive of the buildings were the oldest of the buildings. Then the issue about neighborhood level diversity. Nobody's under obligation to agree with kind of our perception of things, but we just happen to have a philosophical position that healthy citizens, healthy neighborhoods are a reflection of the demographic, economic, social distribution of the city as a whole. We just think that's healthy. We just think that's good. And it's an issue that we often look at, and the reason we do is another one of the mythologies is, well, historic districts, that's kind of nice for rich white people, but it's not, doesn't have anything to do with the rest of us. So here's Indianapolis. Again, the horizontal line is the share of white population in Indianapolis, and then each of the historic districts. Now, some of them are more white, some of them more black, but to a large extent, it's a reflection. Who lives in historic districts is by race who lives in the city as a whole. Here is the state of Rhode Island, and where we looked at by income levels. Again, when I first saw the data, I thought my colleagues were trying to set me up for a joke, because the data is so perfectly correlated between income levels, who lives in historic districts, who lives in the state as a whole. Now, Rhode Island is not a particularly diverse state racially, but to the extent it is, in fact, it's a reflection. Who lives in historic districts is who lives in the city as a whole. Here's San Antonio, again, not a big black population, but it's a majority Hispanic city. And again, the distribution of Hispanics in historic district is roughly the same as in the city as a whole. Here's Los Angeles, one of the most diverse cities in the world, certainly in the US. And other is Pacific Islanders, Native Americans, kind of what does fall in other categories. But other category, Asian category, black category, all had a larger share in historic districts than they did in the city as a whole. The only group slightly underrepresented in historic districts was white people. And then Buffalo, one of my favorites. Buffalo is a challenging city, economically, but also racially challenging. And we said we wanted to look at where people live by race in Buffalo. And we just arbitrarily said, here's what we're going to do. If a neighborhood is more than 80% either white or black, we're going to call that a segregated neighborhood. It's not segregated because the law is. If the neighborhood was between 60 and 80% one race or the other, we're going to call it a mixed neighborhood. And a neighborhood that's between 40 and 60% of one race, meaning there's got to be 40 to 60% of the other race, we're going to call those fully integrated neighborhoods. Well, blacks in the rest of Buffalo, 70% live in all black neighborhoods, essentially all black neighborhoods. True, only 55% in historic districts. In the mixed race, 21% in the city as a whole, 27% in historic districts. Fully integrated neighborhoods, only 9% in the city as a rest of the city, twice that amount, 17% in historic districts. And look at the white side, kind of same pattern. 36% of whites live in all white neighborhoods, only 22% in historic districts. And fully integrated neighborhoods, 17%, in the rest of the city, 22%. The reality is the only place, statistically, where you're likely to find in Buffalo, New York, a white person living next door to a black person is in historic districts. It is this contribution of the diversity in the city. And then the issue that's true now every place, and that's the issue of housing affordability. There's a thing in housing economics called housing cost burden. That if a household is spending more than 30% of its income on housing, they're called housing cost burden. So here is Miami-Dade County, again, a place with a real housing affordability issue. And it's not that there's not problems for both renters and owners. Two largest shares in the housing cost burden, but less in historic districts than in the rest of the city. And then as this housing valuation has kind of gone on, and more academic look at it, the scholars in the area say, well, you know, we're missing something where we're only talking about the rent or the mortgage payment, because another key variable is how much people have to spend on transportation. You know, you might get something if you live 40 miles out of town, you might get a cheaper house, but if you have to drive 80 miles a day, that kind of wipes it out. So this new measure called H plus T, housing plus transportation. And here we look in, and then if you're spending more than 45% of your household income on those two, you're called, you know, housing and transportation burden. Again, way too many in Los Angeles, but 50% fall in that category in the historic districts, almost 2/3 in the rest of the city. So whatever that pattern is, in fact, it's less desperate in historic districts than the rest. And then this related issue about gentrification. You stupid historic district, you're the ones who are causing gentrification, blah, blah, blah. Well, when we first, our client in Los Angeles was the Los Angeles Conservancy, the major preservation advocacy group, and they said, in our first meeting with me, they said, look, gentrification is a big issue in Los Angeles. You can't write a story without, you can't do a study without including gentrification. They said, we don't know what the answer is going to be, and if it's bad news, but nobody will take the study seriously if you simply don't address the gentrification study. So look at the damn thing. Well, we were fortunate in that some people way smarter than us at USC and UCLA had done a really comprehensive gentrification study in Los Angeles over 15 years, and the orange areas are the census block areas that they identified as gentrifying. You see them all over. We took their map, overlaid it with the local historic districts, and those are the hatched areas, and what you can see is almost no correlation. Maybe 10% of the gentrifying areas are in historic districts, and maybe 15% of the historic districts are gentrifying areas, but it's not, there's no correlation whatsoever. Almost take the case, this is just a supposition, I'm not saying we have to be able to prove it, but you look at these areas right here in the historic district, surrounded by these gentrifying, it's almost as if those historic districts are a mitigator of gentrification. You can't be tearing down that 1920s bungalow and put up a 40-story condo in those areas. But anyway, the point is, this idea, this myth, that well, historic districts are causing all this is just not true. Then, I'm always interested in this first place of return. So we have this swath of America, the Midwest and the Northeast, that for decades have lost population, and many of which have started to come back. So my curiosity was, well, when people start coming back, when the population starts growing, where do they come to? Where do they return to? So here's Philadelphia. I don't know a lot about Philly, but in the spring I teach a class every Tuesday morning, so I take the train up from Washington, go teach my class, take 2 students to lunch, and go back. But I remember when the 2010 census comes out, that the big headlines in Philly, we finally turned the corner. After losing population for 50 years, we're finally growing again. Not much, but we're finally growing again. Except they weren't. The population in the historic districts in Philadelphia grew. The rest of the city still lost population. In Washington, D.C., where I live, same pattern, is that 45% live in the historic districts, but 62% of the growth was in those districts. Boston turned the corner a decade earlier, but again, the pattern was 22% of the population lives there, but that's where 36% of the growth took place. So I say to mayors and city council members and city managers, hey, if you're losing population, you want to grow again, for God's sake, don't be tearing down the neighborhoods. They're going to be the first place where people want to come back. In fact, often historic neighborhoods are the attractors of growth. Again, here in Miami-Dade County, a lot of growth taking place, but greater share of population growth in historic districts. Now, think what that means. You can't have population growth and have no change. This idea that historic districts are somehow placed in amber and there's never change, just not true. That's where the population growth is changing. In the state of Rhode Island, there's not unlike North Carolina that keeps growing. Rhode Island is that kind of flat population growth. But the historic district, only 12% of the population lives in historic districts, but that's where 56% of the growth took place was in those historic districts. Here's Pittsburgh. Again, local historic district grew in population, the rest of the city declined. This has a consequence in terms of tax generation. Saratoga Springs, the value in local governments, North Carolina, New York State, whatever, large dependency on property tax, which is affected by property value. So there's value per acre, twice as much in historic districts. Here's Miami-Dade County, 3 times the value in historic districts. And sometimes, we did a study in Savannah, and sometimes there's concern, well, yeah, but what's happened is you've got the gentrifying neighborhoods and nobody can afford to live there anymore, and nobody would risk it. Well, there's at least one of the historic districts in Savannah where that's largely the case, where it's all, I couldn't afford to live. Most of us in the room couldn't afford to live. It's very expensive. And no denying that, but we made the calculation in Savannah is the incremental value of properties in historic districts, the incremental increase in value, not all of the value, just the increase in value greater than the rest of the city. It generates a tax revenue, we call it the preservation premium. Just that extra amount of property tax generation because of the increased rate of value increase in historic districts means the school district would get another $3.5 million a year, enough to pay 86 teachers. That the city of Savannah gets $3 million. They could have subsidized housing for 1,200 families. That the county gets $3 million, which could pay a quarter of the sheriff's budget. So yeah, it's happening. Yeah, it's happening. Downside, but it's extra revenue that you, the 3 local governments, are getting. You can use it to address the problems that may be generated. Often preservation is a catalyst for other kinds of activities. And one of my favorite examples is Rouse's Market in New Orleans. This is not one of the really cool, the Garden District or the French Quarter. It's a neighborhood in New Orleans where there was this 1950s automobile dealership that had sat empty for years until a guy bought it and converted it to this grocery store. But between Katrina and when this project was done, nothing happened in the neighborhood. Nothing happened until Rouse's Market happened. And followed by $140 million worth of investment surrounding it, mostly on vacant lots. It wasn't like there, mostly on vacant lots. We talked to all of the developers and said, why did you do that? Well, because of Rouse's Market. We knew that was going to catalyze, and going to draw people, and we're willing to make this $100 million of investment on that contract. Historic building, rehabilitating the state and local tax credits as the catalyst for other stuff. Another one is in Miller's Court, industrial building in the center of the city. Again, sat vacant forever. That a developer redeveloped, targeted market was teachers, public employees, cops and firefighters. And again, what happened is that it sparked investment all around, and it changed. The whole city of Baltimore still losing population, area around Miller's Court growing in population. And then this issue, and here's where the kids going on Halloween counts. I got to figure out a way to do that. Is that for a long time, there's this argument that maybe that there's a kind of social component, social value in historic neighborhoods that is greater than elsewhere. And we've struggled on how to measure that exactly. But we were doing a study in Indianapolis, and the client said, go and talk to the people at Keep Indianapolis Beautiful. Instead of just doing interesting things, and so we did. And we went down, young guy said, oh, here's what we're doing, and they had a program called Adopt a Block program. There really is kind of what we call it, well, that's a real social expression. People stand up and say, here, I'll do this, I'll go out and pull weeds on Saturday or whatever. Well, we looked at their map of that and said, wow, that looks pretty familiar. Huge correlation between the historic districts and that Adopt a Block program, kind of social measure of value. But I think that I could do the same thing on kids. So I just have to figure out how to count those. Maybe I can get a contract with Hershey candy bars or whatever. Great idea. Anyway, I want to finish with a quotation by a great American economist, John Kenneth Galbraith. He wrote this: the preservation movement has one great curiosity. There is never retrospective controversy or regret. Preservationists are the only people in the world who are invariably confirmed in their wisdom after the fact. So that's what you all are doing. Thanks very much. I'm happy to